two newlyweds, full of dreams, traveled to paradise for their honeymoon, only to face unthinkable horror. What began as a celebration of love ended in a brutal double murder that shocked the world. This is the chilling true story of Catherine and Ben Mullaney's final days in Antigua. It was the summer of 2008 when Catherine Mullaney and her husband Ben set off for what should have been the happiest trip of their lives. Both were 31 years old, just beginning their marriage, and filled with hope for the future. Catherine, a physiotherapist from Wales, was known by her friends and colleagues as caring, intelligent, and dedicated to her patients. Ben, also from Wales, was a trainee general practitioner, working toward a career in medicine. They had spent years studying and preparing for the responsibilities of helping others, and now, after a beautiful wedding, they were finally husband and wife. To celebrate their union, they traveled across the Atlantic to the Caribbean island of Antigua, one of the Leeward Islands known for its turquoise seas, sandy beaches, and lush hills. Antigua was a popular holiday destination for couples, especially honeymooners, who came seeking both romance and relaxation. For Catherine and Ben, it seemed like the perfect setting to unwind after the excitement and exhaustion of planning their wedding. They checked into the Cocos Hotel, a well-known resort perched on a hillside with stunning views of the sea. The cottages offered privacy and seclusion, perfect for newlyweds wanting time to themselves. From the outside, their trip appeared like a dream. Two young professionals, just starting out, enjoying the reward of a tropical honeymoon. They took photographs, exchanged quiet moments, and imagined the life they were building together. But dreams can be fragile, and in this case, theirs was about to be destroyed in the most brutal way imaginable. In the early hours of July 27, 2008, while the Mullaney's slept inside their cottage, two young men were making their way through the grounds of the hotel. Their names were Avi Howell and Connie Martin. Both were in their early 20s, both unemployed, and both already known to the authorities for their involvement in other crimes. They had grown up on the island, but had chosen paths of theft and violence. That night, they were armed with guns and looking for money or valuables. They believed that the cottages of honeymooners, like the Mullaney's, would provide easy targets. Howell and Martin forced their way into the Mullaney's cottage, shattering the safety and intimacy that the couple had expected in their holiday retreat. What happened next was sudden, chaotic, and devastating. The two men confronted Catherine and Ben, demanding their possessions. Accounts from the investigation suggest that the Mullaney's either resisted or tried to stop the intruders. In response, Howell and Martin opened fire. Both Catherine and Ben were shot in the head. The violence was immediate, leaving no chance for escape or defense. Catherine died instantly from her wound. Ben, however, though gravely injured, survived the initial attack. He was left in a coma, unconscious, his life hanging in the balance. The intruders fled the scene, leaving behind destruction, grief, and unanswered questions. When staff at the hotel discovered the scene, panic spread quickly. What had been a place of beauty and romance was now a crime scene. The shooting of two tourists, young, newly married, and from another country, was a devastating blow not only to the victims' families, but to Antigua itself. News of the attack spread fast. In the United Kingdom, Catherine's family and Ben's family received the shattering news that their loved ones had been shot while on honeymoon. For them, it was incomprehensible. Just days earlier, they had watched Catherine walk down the aisle, glowing in her wedding dress. They had seen Ben's joy as he began his new life as a husband. Now they were hearing words like coma and fatal. Catherine's body was prepared to be flown home. Ben remained on life support in Antigua before being transferred back to the UK. Doctors fought to save him, but his injuries were too severe. After a week, his family made the heartbreaking decision to withdraw life support. Ben died soon after, reuniting with his wife in death. The loss was crushing. Here were two people in their early 30s, their careers ahead of them, their family life just beginning, taken away in a senseless act of violence. Their deaths were not only personal tragedies, but also international news. Media outlets across Britain and the Caribbean reported on the case, framing it as the murder of innocence itself, a honeymoon turned into a nightmare. For Antigua, a country heavily dependent on tourism, the crime threatened more than reputation. Safety is the cornerstone of tourism, and suddenly the island was under scrutiny. A destination once seen as paradise was now linked with danger. The pressure on local police was immense. They needed to solve this case, not only to deliver justice, but also to restore the confidence of visitors. Investigators launched an island-wide search. Leads soon began to point toward Howell and Martin. Their reputations as troublemakers were already established, and they had been connected to other robberies and violent crimes. Witnesses and evidence slowly tied them to the Mullany murders. The island, though small, was shaken by the thought that two of its own young men could carry out such a crime. The turning point came when police captured the suspects. The relief was felt not just in Antigua, but in the Mullany's homeland as well. The capture meant that there was hope for accountability. Without it, Catherine and Ben's story might have ended with despair and no justice. With it, there was at least the possibility of closure. As the investigation unfolded, the details revealed the cold reality of the attack. Howell and Martin had not targeted Catherine and Ben personally. They had been looking for money and valuables, and the Mullanys had simply been unlucky victims in the wrong place at the wrong time. That randomness made the crime even more haunting. It showed how fragile life is, how quickly everything can be destroyed by the actions of others. Back in the UK, friends, family, and colleagues mourned. They remembered Catherine as a woman full of kindness, always ready to help her patients, always bringing energy and compassion to her work. They remembered Ben as dedicated to medicine, full of humor and warmth, someone who would have gone on to treat and comfort countless patients. In memory of the couple, their families established the Mullany Fund, a charity aimed at supporting healthcare and education projects. In this way, the families turned pain into purpose, ensuring that Catherine and Ben's names would live on through acts of kindness and opportunity. Though their lives were taken, their legacy became one of giving. The theme of this story, one that would later be repeated during the trial, was clear. This was not only about two killers and their crimes. It was about the fragility of human life, the cruelty of senseless violence, and the way that entire families and communities are changed forever by one night of destruction. For Antigua, the crime became a scar. For the Mullanys' families, it became a wound that would never truly heal. For the world, it was a reminder of how quickly innocence and joy can be shattered. And yet, this was only the beginning of the story. The full truth of what had happened and the consequences for those responsible would come out later. For now, the world watched, stunned, as the island of Antigua faced questions it had never wanted to answer. The deaths of Catherine and Ben Mullany cast a long shadow over both Antigua and the United Kingdom. What had begun as a romantic honeymoon turned into an international crime story that drew media attention, diplomatic pressure, and widespread public mourning. The murder of two young professionals, both only 31 years old, both in the prime of their lives, was shocking enough. But the fact that it had happened in a paradise setting made the story resonate even more. People everywhere asked the same question: how could such brutality intrude on a holiday meant to celebrate love? As Catherine's family prepared for her funeral in Wales, and as Ben's parents made the agonizing decision to withdraw life support after days of vigil by his hospital bed, police in Antigua were intensifying their investigation. The small Caribbean island was used to tourism being its lifeblood, but now the international headlines painted a different picture. Antigua was suddenly associated not with pristine beaches, but with violence, danger, and a brutal double shooting. The local authorities knew they had to move quickly. The investigation began with a wide net. Detectives combed through witness statements, hotel records, and physical evidence from the crime scene at the Coco's Hotel. Security in the area had been light, and the attackers had taken advantage of that vulnerability. Yet they had left behind enough clues for the police to begin building a picture of what happened. Early on, the suspicion fell on two young local men already known to law enforcement, Avi Howell and Conneal Martin. Both were in their 20s, both unemployed, and both had reputations that stretched beyond petty theft. They had been implicated in violent robberies, and their names circulated among the island's communities whenever trouble arose. To the investigators, the pattern seemed all too familiar. Two men accustomed to targeting vulnerable victims, escalating their crimes as they went. Now, they had crossed the line into murder. The pressure on the police was immense. British officials were demanding answers, as were grieving families back home. The Antiguan government feared that tourism, the very core of its economy, was at risk. Tourists wanted safety. Without it, the island's appeal would be shattered. Every passing day, without an arrest, was another blow to Antigua's reputation. Eventually, through interviews, informants, and forensic links, the police gathered enough evidence to make their move. Howell and Martin were arrested, sparking both relief and outrage. Relief that the killers had been caught, outrage that young Antiguans could carry out such an act against guests on their island. For many residents, tourism was not just an industry, but a way of life. To betray that with violence was to betray the island itself. Back in Wales, the Mullany families followed every development. They had already endured the unbearable, the sudden loss of Catherine, followed days later by the loss of Ben. Their grief was doubled, their sense of injustice overwhelming. Friends and relatives spoke of the cruel irony that Catherine, who spent her career helping patients recover from injury, and Ben, who was training to save lives as a doctor, had both been struck down by senseless violence. Funerals were held, tributes poured in, and the media continued to follow the case. Photographs of the smiling couple on their wedding day appeared alongside headlines about murder, trial, and the search for justice. What should have been a lasting celebration of love was now frozen in time as a prelude to tragedy. Meanwhile, in Antigua, the legal process began to take shape. Prosecutors worked to build a solid case against Howell and Martin. Witnesses were interviewed again, ballistics reports were studied, and the timeline of the night of July 27th was reconstructed piece by piece. It became clear that the Mullanys were not targeted personally. They were victims of circumstance. Honeymooners chosen because their cottage was secluded and because Howell and Martin thought they might be carrying valuables. That randomness was one of the most frightening aspects of the case. It meant that no one, not even two young newlyweds in paradise, was safe from violence when greed and recklessness collided. The Mullanys had not sought danger. They had not provoked it. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The story reverberated far beyond Antigua and Wales. International travelers questioned whether the Caribbean was truly safe. British newspapers carried emotional editorials about the risks of crime in tourist destinations. Antiguan officials tried to reassure the world that justice would be done. But no words could erase the images of a smiling bride and groom whose lives had been ended before they had even begun to build a family together. As the months turned into years, the case inched toward trial. The families on both sides of the Atlantic endured delays, hearings, and the slow grind of the justice system. For Catherine's parents and Ben's parents, the waiting was almost unbearable. Every court date was a reminder of the empty chairs at their dinner tables, the milestones that would never be celebrated. The grief was permanent, but justice felt elusive. During this period, the Mullany Fund was created. Rather than allow the couple's story to be defined only by their deaths, their families chose to honor their lives. The fund supported education and health care initiatives, echoing the professions Catherine and Ben had chosen. Through scholarships and aid, the couple's names lived on in a way that reflected their commitment to helping others. In this, the families found a small measure of solace. Though their children were gone, their spirit of service could continue. Still, the case loomed. Everyone knew that the final chapter had yet to be written. Howell and Martin were in custody, but they had not yet been judged by a jury. Their guilt was alleged, their punishment uncertain. What had happened in that hotel cottage was clear. 2 intruders, 2 gunshots, 2 lives stolen, but the law demanded a full accounting. By the time the trial date was set, the world's attention returned once again to Antigua. Reporters prepared to cover the hearings, legal teams sharpened their arguments, and families braced themselves for the ordeal of hearing the evidence laid out in court. The anticipation was heavy, the stakes enormous. For Catherine and Ben, there would be no second chances, no future careers, no children, no anniversaries. For Howell and Martin, the outcome of the trial would decide the rest of their lives. For the families, it was the only path left toward some form of closure. As the courtroom prepared to open, one truth was already undeniable. The Honeymoon murders had changed everything. They had scarred a nation, devastated two families, and left a haunting reminder that paradise can sometimes conceal darkness. The trial would reveal more about the motives, the actions, and the choices that led two young men to destroy two young lives. And at its conclusion, it would deliver the final judgment that everyone had been waiting for. But that part of the story was still to come. For now, the world waited. By the time the trial of Avi Howell and Conneal Martin began in 2011, 3 years had already passed since the murders of Catherine and Ben Mullaney. For the families in Wales, those years had been marked by grief, remembrance, and the constant strain of waiting for justice. For the island of Antigua, they had been years of reckoning, as the case of the Honeymoon murders had left a scar on its international image and shaken its residents' sense of safety. The courthouse became the stage on which all of these emotions would converge. From the first day, the trial drew attention. Reporters filled the seats, family members attended with heavy hearts, and security was tight. This was not just a local matter. It was a case that had resonated across borders. The courtroom air was heavy with the knowledge that the lives of 4 families, the Mullanys in Wales and the families of Howell and Martin in Antigua, would be shaped by what was about to unfold. The prosecution laid out its case carefully. The central argument was straightforward. Howell and Martin, both in their early 20s and both unemployed, had armed themselves, broken into the Mullanys' private cottage at Coco's Hotel on July 27, 2008, and carried out a robbery that ended in murder. The evidence presented to the jury included ballistics reports linking the bullets to the weapons used, testimony from witnesses who tied the men to the crime, and forensic traces that placed them at the scene. The prosecutors emphasized that Catherine and Ben had not been targeted personally. They had been chosen at random, victims of opportunity in what should have been the safest moment of their lives. The randomness of the attack was underlined again and again, reinforcing the cruelty and senselessness of the crime. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the strength of the evidence, raising questions about witness credibility and the handling of forensic material. But the overall narrative of the night of July 27th remained intact. 2 armed men had broken into the Mullanys' cottage, demanded valuables, and when resistance was met, fired their weapons with deadly consequences. For the Mullaney families, sitting through the trial was its own form of torment. They were forced to relive the horror of what had happened, hearing clinical details about the gunshots, the wounds, and the final moments of their children's lives. Photographs, medical reports, and eyewitness accounts were all part of the proceedings. Each piece of evidence, while essential for justice, was another reminder of the devastating loss they carried every day. The courtroom also heard about the lives of Catherine and Ben. Their careers, their characters, and their promise for the future were described not only to humanize them for the jury, but also to highlight the magnitude of what had been stolen. Catherine was remembered as a physiotherapist who poured herself into her work, helping patients recover and return to their lives. Ben was portrayed as a trainee doctor with a bright future, a man whose path in medicine was just beginning. Together, they had represented hope, compassion, and dedication, values that stood in stark contrast to the greed and recklessness of their killers. As the weeks passed, the evidence continued to pile up. Witnesses recounted seeing Howell and Martin before and after the crime. Forensic experts tied them to the weapons, and prosecutors drew a line between this crime and other acts of violence for which the 2 men had already been suspected. The turning point of the trial came when the evidence painted a clear, unshakable picture. There was no single dramatic confession or outburst. Instead, it was a steady accumulation of facts that left little room for doubt. Piece by piece, the jury was shown how the events of that night could only lead back to Howell and Martin. After deliberations, the jury returned its verdict. Both Avi Howell and Conneal Martin were found guilty of the murders of Catherine and Ben Mullany. The courtroom was silent as the words were read, the gravity of the moment pressing down on everyone present. For the families of the victims, it was a moment of relief, though tempered by the reality that nothing could bring Catherine and Ben back. For the families of the defendants, it was the crushing acknowledgement that their sons would spend the rest of their lives in prison. The sentencing followed. Both Howell and Martin received life imprisonment. The judgment was firm, reflecting the seriousness of the crime and the impact it had left on both Antigua and the wider world. The courtroom, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now carried a heavy finality. Justice, in the legal sense, had been delivered. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed. For the Mullany families, there was a measure of closure, though not peace. Their children were still gone, their lives cut short, and no sentence could change that. Yet the knowledge that the killers would never again be free to harm others was a small comfort. For Antigua, the verdict was a signal that the island could face its darkest moment head-on and hold those responsible accountable. The legacy of the case extended beyond the courtroom. In the UK, the story continued to resonate. Newspapers recounted the journey from honeymoon to tragedy to justice. Friends and colleagues of Catherine and Ben continued to speak of their loss, but also of their enduring memory. The Mullany Fund grew, helping projects in healthcare and education, ensuring that the names of Catherine and Ben would be linked not only with tragedy, but also with hope and opportunity for others. For Antigua, the scars remained. The case had shaken confidence in the island's safety, and though the conviction brought a sense of justice, it did not erase the damage. Tourism officials worked hard to restore the island's reputation, but the shadow of the honeymoon murders lingered. It was a reminder that paradise, too, could harbor violence, and that trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild. The story of Catherine and Ben Mullany is not just one of crime and punishment. It is a story of love interrupted, of families torn apart, and of communities forced to confront hard truths. It is a reminder of the fragility of life, of how quickly joy can turn to tragedy, and of how violence leaves echoes that spread far beyond the initial act. The turning point, both in the investigation and in the trial, was the capture and conviction of Howell and Martin. Without that, the story would have ended with despair. With it, there was at least the assurance that accountability had been achieved. Yet even as justice was done, the broader lesson remained. Violence does not end with a trigger pulled. It ripples outward, affecting parents, siblings, friends, nations, and even strangers who read the headlines. Catherine and Ben had traveled to Antigua with hope in their hearts, beginning a life together that promised so much. In the end, their story became one of loss, but also of resilience. Through the Mullany Fund, through the memories cherished by their families, and through the lives touched by their story, their legacy endured. As the trial closed, as the sentences were handed down, and as the world slowly moved on, those closest to Catherine and Ben held on to the truth that love, even when cut short, remains stronger than violence. Their story, told in news reports, in courtrooms, and in memorials, became not only a tragedy, but also a testament to the enduring human need for justice, remembrance, and compassion. On a dream honeymoon in Fiji's turquoise paradise, newlywed Christian was found brutally slain in her luxury villa. Her husband vanished by kayak into the night. What began as a celebration turned into an international manhunt, and a chilling courtroom drama you won't stop watching until the very end. In July 2022, Christian and Bradley Robert Dawson traveled thousands of miles from their home in Memphis, Tennessee, to the far side of the Pacific Ocean. They were newly married, fresh from the celebrations that had marked the beginning of their life together. For them, this trip was more than a vacation. It was their honeymoon, the symbolic first chapter of a shared future. Christ was 36 years old, a pharmacist who had worked hard to reach her position. After earning her degree from the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, she had built a reputation as someone meticulous in her work and generous in her personal life. She was known for her warm smile and her ability to put patients at ease. Friends described her as the kind of person who could make a stranger feel like an old friend in minutes. Bradley, 40, was an IT specialist employed by Youth Villages, a non-profit organization that helps children and families in crisis. In the office, he was considered quiet and competent. He and Chris met through friends, and their relationship moved at a pace that, to outsiders, seemed steady and promising. They shared values, both had careers centered on service, and both enjoyed travel and adventure. Their decision to marry seemed natural, a joining of two people who wanted the same things from life. For their honeymoon, they chose Turtle Island Resort in Fiji's Yasawa Islands. The resort was not a typical tourist destination. It catered to a small number of guests, just 14 couples at a time. Each couple had a private villa. The island's isolation and the resort's luxury made it a place people saved for, sometimes for years, to experience just once. It was the sort of place where staff remembered guests by name and where every view looked like it had been pulled from a postcard. The first days passed as one might expect for a couple in love. They swam in clear waters, lounged on the beach, and took excursions arranged by the resort. Staff recalled seeing them laughing together, sharing meals, and taking photos against the backdrop of the South Pacific. It looked like everything a honeymoon should be. But by the third evening, something changed. Guests in neighboring villas reported hearing raised voices from behind the closed door of Chris and Bradley's room. At first, it was muffled, indistinct, just the tones of two people in disagreement. But the voices grew sharper. One guest later recalled hearing Chris' voice, higher in pitch, strained. The sound stopped as abruptly as they had started. No one reported seeing either of them after that. The following morning, Bradley appeared alone for breakfast. Staff noticed, but didn't immediately think much of it. When asked about Chris, Bradley said she was feeling unwell and had decided to rest in the villa. He seemed calm enough, and on a remote island, people tended to take such explanations at face value. By lunchtime, however, Bradley was again alone. Staff asked once more about Chris' absence. Bradley gave a similar answer. She was still resting. Something about his demeanor struck one of the staff members as odd. Later, when housekeeping attempted to service the villa, Bradley was evasive, saying it wasn't a good time. Concern mounting, a member of the resort staff decided to check in regardless. Inside, they found Chris' body on the bathroom floor. There was blood on the tiles, on shards of broken glass. Her injuries were severe, blunt force trauma to the head and face. There were deep cuts, consistent with glass breakage, but the bruising told a story of repeated blows. It was immediately clear that this had not been an accident. Authorities were called from the nearest police station, but Turtle Island's remoteness meant they would not arrive instantly. In those critical hours, Bradley was nowhere to be found. It didn't take long for staff to realize he had fled. He had not attempted to leave Fiji entirely. Instead, he had taken a kayak and paddled across open water to the nearby island of Matakawalavu. It was an act that, on its face, looked desperate. Dangerous waters, uncertain distance, and no guarantee of a safe landing. But he made it, carrying a small bag containing his passport and personal belongings. When police finally located him, he appeared tired but unharmed. He did not resist arrest. From the outset, his account was inconsistent. He said he and Chris had argued, that she had been drinking, that things had gotten out of hand. At other times, he claimed he could not remember what had happened, or that she had suffered a fall. Investigators quickly determined that his explanations did not match the evidence found at the scene. News of the tragedy traveled quickly back to Memphis. Friends and family were stunned. Chris' colleagues at the pharmacy where she had worked found it almost impossible to reconcile the image of the devoted, kind-hearted professional they knew with the reports coming from Fiji. Bradley's co-workers were equally shocked. While they knew him as quiet and private, they had never seen signs of the kind of violence the authorities were now alleging. In Fiji, the police began piecing together the timeline. They interviewed resort guests and staff, many of whom confirmed hearing the argument on the night before Chris' body was found. They examined the villa, collecting blood samples, photographing injuries, and marking the locations of broken glass and other physical evidence. Their conclusions pointed away from any possibility of accident. The injuries were too severe, the distribution of wounds too telling. The kayak escape and the possession of a passport suggested not shock or panic, but intent to flee. As the investigation progressed, more details emerged about the hours before the murder. Some staff recalled seeing Bradley drinking alone earlier that evening. Others remembered seeing him pacing outside the villa in the dark, appearing agitated. The pieces of the story began to align into a grim picture. An argument escalating beyond control, a sudden explosion of violence, and an attempt to escape responsibility by vanishing into the islands. Bradley was formally charged with murder. The authorities moved him to a secure facility on the main island of Viti Levu, where he awaited trial. In Fiji, murder carries a potential life sentence, and the case drew attention both locally and internationally. For many, it was the contrast that made the story so gripping, a love story, set in one of the most beautiful places on earth, ending in brutality. Back in the United States, reporters dug into the couple's history. Their courtship had seemed unremarkable, even wholesome. There were no public signs of trouble, but those who had known them only casually began to question what they had missed. Was there tension beneath the surface? Did friends overlook warning signs because the couple looked so well matched? In Fiji, the small local court system prepared for what would become one of the most closely watched trials in recent memory. The prosecution's challenge would be to translate the forensic evidence into a narrative a judge could accept without doubt. The defense would seek to undermine that narrative, to cast Bradley as a man caught in tragic circumstances, not a killer. For now, the island where Christ lost her life had returned to its quiet rhythms. Guests came and went. The villa where she had died remained closed, a reminder to those who worked there of the violence that had shattered the peace. On the other side of the world, Chris's family faced the unimaginable, planning her funeral instead of hearing her stories about the honeymoon. Bradley Robert Dawson sat in a small, plain cell in Suva, the capital of Fiji, his world reduced to 4 concrete walls and the echo of his own thoughts. Just days earlier, he and Christian had been in a private villa on a remote island, surrounded by turquoise waters and white sand. Now, the island paradise was a crime scene, and he was the man accused of turning it into one. The first few days after his arrest were dominated by police interviews. Fiji's Criminal Investigations Department moved quickly. Detectives had the physical evidence. Photographs of the bathroom where Chris's body was found, the glass shards stained with her blood, the patterned bruising on her head and face, the cuts on her arms, the broken watch still on her wrist. They also had witness statements from guests and staff. One by one, witnesses recounted the same basic timeline. On the evening of July 8, 2022, the couple attended dinner. They appeared in good spirits at first. Bradley was drinking wine, Chris had a cocktail. They ate together, smiled for a few photographs with other guests, and then returned to their villa. Sometime later, voices rose from behind their closed door. At least 2 guests heard the argument. One described it as heated, with shouting from both sides. Another remembered hearing what they thought was something heavy striking a wall or the floor, followed by a sudden silence. The next morning, Bradley appeared at breakfast alone. His explanation, that Chris was unwell, was casual, almost dismissive. To staff, there was no visible sign of urgency or distress. But by midday, his behavior began to seem unusual. He kept to himself, avoided eye contact, and was reluctant to let housekeeping into the villa. It was only when a staff member insisted on checking that Chris' body was found. By the time police arrived on Turtle Island, Bradley was gone. The kayak he had taken was missing, as was a small waterproof bag from the villa. His absence and the presence of his passport inside that bag painted a clear picture in investigators' minds. He had been attempting to escape. When they located him in Matakawalava village more than 24 hours later, he did not resist. Villagers said he seemed tired, sunburned, and wary, but not injured. The police took him into custody and brought him back to the mainland. In the days that followed, forensic experts combed through the villa. They measured distances, studied the blood patterns, and examined the nature of Christ's injuries. The conclusion was consistent. She had been struck multiple times, with enough force to cause catastrophic damage. The glass cuts were secondary injuries, likely caused after she had already been incapacitated. The location of the body, inside the bathroom, partially slumped against the wall, suggested she had not moved after the attack. Detectives confronted Bradley with this evidence. His responses shifted. At times, he denied hurting her. At other times, he suggested they had been arguing and she had fallen. Once, he claimed to have blacked out during the argument, saying the next thing he remembered was seeing her injured. None of these explanations matched the forensic evidence. The investigation expanded to Memphis. Authorities contacted family members, friends, and co-workers to piece together the couple's relationship history. Most described it as stable and affectionate, though some admitted they had not known the couple long. There were no police reports of prior domestic violence, no documented threats, no obvious signs of trouble. This absence of history made the killing all the more shocking. Meanwhile, Christ's parents traveled to Fiji to recover her body. Their grief was palpable. They spoke to the media, remembering their daughter as vibrant, compassionate, and full of plans for the future. They had trusted Bradley, welcomed him into their family, and now they were struggling to comprehend the reality that he was accused of taking her life. In Fiji, the legal process moved deliberately. Unlike in the United States, where high-profile cases can sometimes unfold in a matter of months, Fiji's system allowed for extended preparation. Both prosecution and defense would need time to review evidence, consult experts, and prepare arguments. Bradley's defense attorneys began building a narrative aimed at undermining the certainty of the prosecution's case. They suggested that the death may have been accidental, that alcohol may have played a role, and that the lack of direct eyewitnesses left room for doubt. The prosecution focused on the physical evidence and the timeline. They emphasized the severity of the injuries, the absence of any call for help, and Bradley's decision to flee the scene. They also pointed to inconsistencies in his statements, arguing that these shifts in his story revealed consciousness of guilt. In the months that followed, Bradley remained in custody. His appearance changed, his hair grew longer, his face more lined. Court appearances were brief, but closely watched by the press. Each time he was let in, cameras clicked, capturing images of a man who once smiled in wedding photos, now standing silent in a defendant's dock. Journalists covering the case often remarked on the contrasts. The breathtaking beauty of Turtle Island against the violence that had occurred there. The image of a honeymoon transformed into a homicide investigation. The calm professionalism of Christ's work in contrast with the chaotic and brutal way her life ended. Inside the courtroom, preliminary hearings laid out the framework of the case. The judge heard summaries of witness accounts, reviewed the chain of custody for evidence, and set deadlines for the submission of expert reports. The prosecution presented photographs of the villa and diagrams showing the location and condition of Christ's body. Back in Memphis, friends organized memorial events for Christ. They raised funds in her name to support causes she cared about, particularly health initiatives for underserved communities. Her absence was felt deeply, especially among those who had seen her just before the trip, full of excitement about the honeymoon. For Bradley, the coming trial would be the defining chapter of his life. In the media, he was already painted as the villain, the husband who killed his wife and tried to escape justice. But in court, the presumption of innocence still stood. His lawyers hinted that they would challenge not just the forensic interpretations, but also the credibility of some witness accounts. They suggested that island conditions could have influenced what people thought they heard or saw. As the first year after the killing passed, the case remained a topic of intense interest in both Fiji and the United States. Reporters dug into the workings of Fiji's legal system, explaining to their audiences how jury trials were rare and how much power rested with the judge. The length of the process was frustrating to Chris's family, but they were determined to see it through. In the months leading up to the trial, the prosecution refined its argument. This was not a momentary accident, but a deliberate and violent act committed during a heated argument. They would rely on expert testimony to explain the nature of Christ's injuries and the improbability of them occurring without intentional force. The defense prepared to counter with their own experts, aiming to raise even the smallest shadow of doubt. The resort, meanwhile, carried on. Guests returned. New couples came for their own honeymoons. But for those who worked there, the memory of that night lingered. The villa where Christ had died was quietly renovated, but some staff admitted they still felt uneasy when passing it. The murder had left a scar not just on the Chin family, but on the island itself. By the time the trial date was set, both sides were ready to present their version of events. For the prosecution, this was about securing justice for a young woman whose life had been brutally cut short. For the defense, it was about saving a man from spending the rest of his life behind bars. The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would pull together every detail from that night. The sounds overheard by other guests, the blood patterns in the bathroom, the kayak escape, the inconsistent statements, and lay them bare before the court. The courtroom in Suva was small compared to those in the United States, but it was packed. Journalists filled the gallery alongside members of the public, attorneys, and court staff. At the front, behind the bench, Justice Riaz Hamza presided over the proceedings. Before him stood the final act of a story that had begun on a remote Fijian island and drawn international attention for over 2 years. Bradley Robert Dawson, now thinner and paler than when he had been arrested, sat in the dock wearing a plain shirt and trousers. His hair had grown longer, streaked with gray at the edges. To his right, his defense team was arranged in a neat row, papers stacked carefully on the table. Across the aisle, the prosecution was ready, their files containing months of work, witness statements, forensic reports, photographs, and expert analyses. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution spoke first. They told the judge that the evidence would prove Bradley Dawson had murdered his wife, Christian, during their honeymoon at Turtle Island Resort in July 2022. They would show that after a heated argument, Dawson struck Christ repeatedly, causing catastrophic head injuries, and then fled the scene by kayak to a neighboring island. The prosecution's theme was simple: a violent act followed by deliberate flight, leaving Christ to die alone. The defense followed with their own statement. They acknowledged the couple had argued that night, but insisted the death was accidental. They claimed Christ had fallen during the dispute, hitting her head on a hard surface. The defense emphasized that no one had seen the attack and that the prosecution's case rested on interpretations of physical evidence. They urged the court to keep an open mind. The first witnesses were staff members from Turtle Island. One described serving dinner to the couple that night. They recalled Bradley drinking more than usual and Christ appearing tense as they left the dining area. Another staff member testified about hearing raised voices from the couple's villa later in the evening. They were too far away to make out words, but the tone was unmistakably angry. Next came the guests from neighboring villas. One guest testified they heard a loud crash, followed by silence, sometime after the shouting. Another described hearing what they thought was crying, then nothing. Their statements painted a consistent picture. Something significant happened in that villa after the argument began. Forensic experts took the stand next. The pathologist who examined Chris's body explained the extent of her injuries. There were multiple blunt force impacts to her head, each powerful enough to cause severe trauma. The cuts on her arms and hands were consistent with defensive wounds, injuries sustained while trying to shield herself. The pattern of bruising, the expert said, was not consistent with a single accidental fall. A blood spatter analyst testified about the bathroom scene. The distribution of blood on the walls and floor suggested multiple blows had been struck. The broken glass likely came from a drinking glass or bottle, shattered during the assault. The prosecution also presented evidence of Bradley's flight. A police officer described the search that led to his capture on Matakawalavu Island. The officer testified that Dawson had his passport, bank cards, and personal items in a waterproof bag, items that indicated preparation to leave, not shock or disorientation. When it was the defense's turn, they called their own experts. One suggested that the head injuries could have occurred if Christ had fallen into the bathroom counter or wall during a heated argument. Another argued that alcohol might have impaired her balance. The defense highlighted the absence of direct eyewitnesses and suggested the prosecution's conclusions were speculative. Throughout the trial, Dawson remained mostly silent. He watched the proceedings closely, occasionally whispering to his lawyers. When he did testify, his demeanor was calm. He admitted there had been an argument that night, triggered by what he described as small disagreements that escalated after alcohol. He claimed Christ became upset and that during the argument she fell and struck her head. He denied hitting her intentionally. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor pressed him on why he had not called for help, why he had left the island in a kayak, and why he had taken his passport. Dawson said he panicked. He claimed he wanted to clear his head and wasn't thinking clearly. The prosecutor countered that his actions showed a clear consciousness of guilt. The trial lasted 8 days. Closing arguments distilled each side's case to its core. The prosecution reminded the judge of the multiple impacts, the defensive wounds, the blood patterns, and the escape attempt. They argued that all of these facts pointed to deliberate violence, not an accident. They urged the court to find Dawson guilty of murder. The defense argued there was reasonable doubt. They repeated that no one had seen the incident and that the injuries could be explained by an accidental fall. They warned against filling gaps in the evidence with assumptions. Justice Hamza took several days to deliberate. When he returned to court, the room was silent. The judge reviewed the evidence aloud, noting the severity of the injuries, the improbability of them being caused by a single fall, and the defendant's actions afterward. He emphasized that Dawson had not sought help and had instead fled, taking his passport and valuables with him. He concluded that the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Bradley Robert Dawson was found guilty of murder. Christ's family wept quietly as the verdict was read. Bradley sat still, his face pale, as if bracing for what would come next. Sentencing was scheduled for the following week. In Fiji, a life sentence is the maximum penalty for murder, but the court must also set a minimum term before parole eligibility. On February 14, 2025, the courtroom filled once again. Before delivering the sentence, Justice Hamza addressed Dawson directly. He said the attack on Christ had been brutal, and the decision to flee afterward showed a lack of remorse and humanity. "Your conduct after the incident was appalling," he said. "You left her alone and helpless, and you attempted to evade justice." Bradley Dawson was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 18 years to be served before he could apply for parole. Given the current state of Fiji's parole system, where the parole board is not active, his actual chances of early release were uncertain at best. After serving the minimum term, he could apply to the Mercy Commission for clemency, but there was no guarantee. Outside the courthouse, Christ's parents spoke briefly to reporters. They expressed relief at the verdict, but said no sentence could truly make up for their loss. "We came here for justice for Christ," her father said. "We got that today, but we will never get our daughter back." Bradley was led away to begin his sentence. His future was now confined to the walls of Fiji's prison system. The trial, the headlines, and the speculation were over, replaced by the reality of a life spent behind bars. Back on Turtle Island, life continued. New couples arrived for honeymoons, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded in one of the villas. For the staff who had been there in July 2022, the memory lingered, a reminder that even in paradise, violence can find its way in. The case of Chris Chun became a cautionary tale in both Fiji and the United States, a story told not for its sensational aspects, but for its stark truth. Love and trust can be broken in the most unexpected and devastating ways. What began as a celebration of a new life together ended as a story of betrayal, violence, and loss, echoing far beyond the shores of a distant island. And for those who followed it from the beginning, the friends, the family, the strangers who had never met Christ, but felt the weight of her story, the final chapter was not closure, but a sober acknowledgement of the fragility of life and the irreversible damage that one night's violence can cause. On her wedding night, 26-year-old Estrella Carrera was glowing in a sparkling silver dress, celebrating what should have been the happiest day of her life. Hours later, she was dead, stabbed by the very man she had just married. This is the haunting true story of love, betrayal, and justice. On the evening of May 11, 2012, in the quiet suburb of Burbank, Illinois, a small celebration marked what should have been the happiest day of a young woman's life. 26-year-old Estrella Carrera had just married her boyfriend, 30-year-old Arnaldo Jimenez. She was a proud mother of 2 children from a previous relationship, and she carried herself with an energy that made people notice her. Friends described her as kind, hardworking, and devoted to her family. For Estrella, the wedding day was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope and promise. Instead, it would become the final day of her life. The wedding itself was intimate, with only close friends and family in attendance. Estrella wore a silver sequin dress, striking and glamorous, chosen for the special occasion. Arnaldo, her new husband, was a man of few words, known for his construction work and a lifestyle that often leaned toward recklessness. Those who knew him described him as proud, sometimes controlling, a man who wanted things his way. Estrella and Arnaldo's relationship had not been without problems, but on this day, those issues seemed set aside as they stood together and said their vows. After the ceremony, the couple joined family and friends at a small celebration. There was laughter, music, and the kind of atmosphere that makes people believe in happy endings. Estrella was radiant, smiling for photos, dancing with loved ones, and holding close to her new husband. Nobody could have imagined that within hours, tragedy would strike. When the party ended late into the night, Estrella and Arnaldo left together in his black Maserati. Witnesses later recalled seeing them drive off, the bride still glowing in her sequin gown. It was the last time anyone outside of Arnaldo would see her alive. What happened next remains pieced together by investigators, but the evidence was clear. At some point during the early morning hours of May 12th, an argument erupted between Estrella and Arnaldo. Police believe the fight turned violent inside the car. Arnaldo, in a fit of rage, pulled a knife and stabbed his new wife multiple times. The exact trigger for the confrontation has never been fully explained, but authorities have suggested that jealousy, anger, and a history of control played a role. Whatever the motive, the result was devastating. The bride was murdered by the groom less than a day after their wedding. Arnaldo did not call for help. He did not take Estrella to a hospital. Instead, investigators say, he drove her back to her apartment in Burbank. There, he placed her body in the bathtub, still dressed in the shimmering wedding gown she had worn hours earlier. Then he fled, leaving behind a crime scene that would soon shock even experienced detectives. On May 13th, concern began to rise among Estrella's family. She was supposed to pick up her children that day, but she never arrived. Calls to her phone went unanswered. For a young mother known to be reliable and dedicated to her kids, this silence was alarming. Her loved ones contacted police, urging them to check on her. When officers entered the apartment, the scene they discovered was haunting. Estrella's body lay lifeless in the bathtub. She was still in her wedding dress, the silver sequins catching the dim light of the room. The contrast between the symbol of joy and the brutal reality of her murder was almost too much to bear. Detectives later described it as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered. News of the discovery spread quickly through the community. Neighbors who had seen Estrella as a cheerful, hard-working young woman struggled to comprehend the loss. The shocking detail of her being found in her wedding dress captured national attention, turning what might have been a local tragedy into a headline-grabbing true crime story. From the very beginning, suspicion fell squarely on Arnaldo Jimenez. He had been the last person seen with Estrella. He had not contacted her family. He had not shown up to work. And now, after the body was found, he was nowhere to be found either. Investigators pieced together his movements. They learned that after leaving Estrella's apartment, Arnaldo made a series of phone calls to relatives, telling them he had done something bad. He then drove south, crossing into Mexico. The hunt for Arnaldo began almost immediately. The Burbank Police Department worked alongside the FBI, who soon took over the case. A warrant was issued for Arnaldo's arrest on charges of first-degree murder. As evidence mounted, his name was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, a place reserved for the most dangerous and elusive suspects. For Estrella's family, the grief was overwhelming. They had celebrated her marriage one day, only to mourn her death the next. Her 2 children, suddenly, without their mother, became the focus of relatives who stepped in to care for them. Friends spoke of Estrella's warmth and energy, remembering her as someone who loved deeply and who deserved so much more than the fate she had met. As the investigation unfolded, authorities painted a picture of a man who had allowed anger and violence to consume him, destroying not only his new wife's life, but his own future as well. The case became a symbol of how quickly domestic violence can escalate, and how the signs, often visible in hindsight, can sometimes go unnoticed until it is too late. The crime scene, the shocking details, and the fugitive on the run all became part of a story that would stretch on for years. For investigators, the mission was clear: bring Arnaldo Jimenez to justice. For Estrella's family, the pain was unending, made worse by the knowledge that the man responsible had escaped across the border. This was only the beginning. What started as a day of celebration had turned into a nightmare, and the pursuit of Arnaldo would take law enforcement across countries and over more than a decade before resolution would finally come. The case of Estrella Carrera, the bride found in her wedding dress, was far from over. The murder of Estrella Carrera shocked not only her family, but the entire community of Burbank, Illinois. A young bride killed within hours of her wedding was a story that stunned even seasoned investigators. As news of the discovery spread, one question hung heavily in the air: where was Arnaldo Jimenez? Detectives quickly pieced together the hours following the crime. Phone records, witness statements, and surveillance all helped form a timeline. Arnaldo had been seen driving his black Maserati that night. After Estrella's body was discovered, the car became a key piece of evidence. It was nowhere to be found. Later, investigators determined that Arnaldo had driven south, making phone calls to his brother and other relatives along the way. Those calls, some of which included vague but troubling admissions, gave detectives the first confirmation that he was on the run. Within days, authorities announced that a warrant had been issued for Arnaldo's arrest. He was charged with first-degree murder, but the search was already complicated. By the time the warrant was active, Arnaldo had crossed state lines, driven through Texas, and made his way into Mexico. Investigators learned he had family ties in places like Nuevo Laredo and other towns near the border. That information gave them leads, but it also meant their suspect was now beyond the easy reach of local law enforcement. For Estrella's family, the grief was compounded by the lack of immediate justice. Her relatives had just buried a young woman whose life had been cut short on what should have been her happiest day. At the funeral, her silver sequined dress, the same gown in which she was found, was spoken about quietly, the symbol of a celebration turned into a crime scene. Her children, too young to understand the magnitude of their loss, clung to relatives who promised to raise them in her memory. As weeks turned into months, investigators refused to let the case grow cold. They worked closely with the FBI, who took the unusual step of adding Arnaldo Jimenez to their 10 most wanted fugitives list. This list, historically reserved for suspects considered especially dangerous or elusive, came with a reward for information leading to his capture. Posters bearing Arnaldo's face began appearing across the country and beyond, labeling him a fugitive wanted for the brutal killing of his bride. Media coverage fueled public interest. The story had all the elements of a true crime headline: love, betrayal, violence, and a desperate escape. News outlets across the United States picked it up, repeating the chilling detail that Estrella had been found in her wedding dress. For many, that detail transformed the story into a haunting reminder of how quickly joy can turn to horror. The FBI traced Arnaldo's movements into Mexico. They believed he was hiding with relatives in towns where the U.S. had limited reach. Tips came in sporadically, but they rarely led to concrete results. At times, rumors suggested that he was working construction in small Mexican communities, blending in among locals. Other times, reports claimed he had traveled deeper into the country, staying off the radar by avoiding large cities. Each lead required investigation, but none produced the breakthrough agents needed. Meanwhile, Estrella's case remained open, the search for Arnaldo stretching into years. Detectives often revisited the details: the sudden argument inside the car, the decision to stab rather than walk away, the act of leaving her body behind. These facts painted a grim portrait of a man capable of cold violence. But for investigators, the challenge was not in proving what happened. It was in finding the man who had done it. For Estrella's family, the wait for justice became agonizing. Birthdays, holidays, and milestones came and went without her. Her children grew older, raised by relatives who tried to give them the stability they had lost. Each year, anniversaries of the wedding-turned-tragedy served as painful reminders. Community members held vigils, speaking out against domestic violence and calling for Arnaldo's capture. Law enforcement never stopped pressing the case. Interpol was alerted. Mexican authorities were informed and asked for cooperation. But locating one man in a country as large and complex as Mexico proved daunting. The border areas were especially difficult, often controlled by organized groups that made investigations risky and complicated. Despite the challenges, Arnaldo remained on the FBI's 10 most wanted list year after year. His image was displayed online, in airports, and in law enforcement bulletins. Each update kept his name in the public eye. Yet he managed to evade capture, moving quietly and relying on family networks to keep him hidden. The years stretched on. For some, it seemed the case might never find resolution. But behind the scenes, investigators continued their work, gathering intelligence, tracing leads, and coordinating with international partners. They knew that fugitives often make mistakes, that they grow comfortable, and that even the most cautious eventually slip. In the meantime, Estrella's story remained a cautionary tale. Advocacy groups highlighted her case as an example of how domestic violence can escalate without warning. Experts spoke of the importance of recognizing red flags in relationships, noting that control, jealousy, and anger often precede violence. The heartbreaking case of a bride killed in her wedding dress became a symbol in campaigns urging people to speak out and seek help when they sense danger. Back in Burbank, detectives never forgot the case. Retired officers would later recall how it stayed with them, both because of the brutality of the crime and the haunting image of Estrella's final moments. Younger officers inherited the file, determined to see it through no matter how much time had passed. As the 10th anniversary of Estrella's death approached, her family renewed their calls for justice. They wanted closure, not just for themselves, but for her children, who were growing up without a mother and without the answers they deserved. The pressure on authorities to resolve the case grew stronger with each passing year. Through it all, Arnaldo Jimenez remained a shadow figure, out there, somewhere, living a life stolen from the justice system. The man who had once stood before family and friends as a groom had become a fugitive, his name synonymous with betrayal and violence. And then, after more than a decade of searching, the tide began to turn. Investigators received word that their fugitive, long thought to be untouchable, had finally made a mistake. Authorities in Mexico were closing in. The capture of Arnaldo Jimenez would mark the turning point in a story that had spanned 13 years. But for Estrella's family, the pain of those years could never be erased. Justice was finally within reach, but it had taken far too long. The next chapter in this story would see the fugitive finally face the consequences he had evaded for so many years. By 2025, more than 12 years had passed since the night Estrella Carrera's life was cut short. For over a decade, her family had lived with unanswered questions and the gnawing pain of knowing the man responsible had not been held accountable. Every year, the FBI continued to feature Arnaldo Jimenez on their 10 most wanted fugitives list, describing him as armed, dangerous, and capable of violence. They believed he was hiding in Mexico, moving from one relative's home to another, blending into neighborhoods where outsiders would never question his presence. The break investigators had long been waiting for finally came in early 2025. Authorities in Mexico, working closely with the FBI, tracked Arnaldo's movements and confirmed his identity. For years, he had managed to stay just a step ahead of law enforcement. But in January 2025, Mexican police moved in. The man who had once vanished into the night after murdering his bride was taken into custody. The arrest made headlines around the world, bringing Estrella Carrera's case back into the spotlight after more than a decade. When news of the capture reached Illinois, Estrella's family responded with mixed emotions. Relief, because the man who had caused so much pain was finally in handcuffs. Anguish, because no arrest could bring back the young woman they had lost. And uncertainty, because the arrest was only the beginning of a new legal process. Extradition back to the United States, a trial, and the long path to justice. The extradition process took time, but eventually Arnaldo was brought back to face charges in Cook County, Illinois. For prosecutors, the case was straightforward. They had physical evidence, a clear timeline, and a fugitive who had spent years running from responsibility. For Estrella's family, sitting in the courtroom was both painful and necessary. They listened as prosecutors described how Arnaldo had argued with Estrella in his Maserati, stabbed her multiple times, then left her body in the bathtub, still wearing her wedding dress. They watched as photographs and evidence were displayed, details they had lived with for years, but which now were presented formally to a jury. Arnaldo, now in his early 40s, looked older than the man who had fled in 2012. The weight of years on the run was clear in his face. In the courtroom, he was no longer just the groom who had turned into a killer. He was a defendant facing the full power of the justice system. The trial revealed more details of the hours after the murder. Witnesses described phone calls Arnaldo had made to his brother, admitting that he had messed up and done something terrible. Investigators testified about the Maserati, which was eventually recovered, stained with evidence of the attack. Neighbors recalled seeing Arnaldo and Estrella drive away after the wedding party, never suspecting it would be the last time they saw her alive. As the trial unfolded, Arnaldo's defense attempted to cast doubt, suggesting that emotions had escalated and that the killing was not premeditated. But prosecutors countered with the brutality of the act, the multiple stab wounds, and the decision to leave Estrella to die without seeking help. They emphasized his flight to Mexico as proof of guilt. Innocent men do not spend 13 years hiding across international borders. The most emotional moments came when Estrella's family members took the stand. They spoke about her life, her kindness, and the 2 children she left behind. They described the devastating moment they learned she had been found dead, and the painful years that followed, waiting for justice that seemed like it would never arrive. Their voices reminded the jury that behind every piece of evidence was a human life taken far too soon. As the case neared its conclusion, Arnaldo himself was given the chance to speak. In a quiet, subdued tone, he admitted responsibility. He confessed that the argument had spiraled out of control, that anger had driven him to a violent act that he could never take back. But for Estrella's family, the words fell hollow. His confession came not in the days after the crime, when it might have mattered, but years later, forced by the weight of evidence and the inevitability of conviction. The jury deliberated, but their decision was swift. Arnaldo Jimenez was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was delivered in a hushed courtroom, the weight of 13 years of waiting finally crashing into the present. Family members wept, some quietly, others openly, as the reality sank in. After so many years, justice had finally been served. At sentencing, prosecutors argued that the brutality of the crime, the attempt to flee, and the lasting impact on Estrella's children warranted the maximum penalty. The judge, reflecting on the facts, agreed. Arnaldo Jimenez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was filled with mixed emotions that day. Relief that the case was over, grief that Estrella's life had been stolen, and anger that it had taken more than a decade for the system to catch up with her killer. For her family, the sentencing brought closure, but not healing. Healing, they knew, would be a lifelong process. Estrella's children, now teenagers, had grown up without their mother. They had been raised by relatives who did their best to give them stability, but the loss had shaped their lives in ways that could never be undone. Her relatives spoke after the sentencing, telling reporters that while justice had been achieved, the wound of Estrella's death would never fully close. The community of Burbank, too, remembered. For years, they had followed the story, holding vigils and keeping her memory alive. The image of Estrella in her wedding dress, smiling, vibrant, full of hope, remained etched in their minds. It was a reminder of how quickly life can be taken and how love can turn into violence. The story of Estrella Carrera became part of a larger conversation about domestic violence and the dangers that can hide within relationships. Advocates pointed to her case as a reason to speak out, to recognize red flags, and to ensure that victims have the support they need to escape dangerous situations. Her tragic story became a warning, but also a call to action. For law enforcement, the conclusion of a case reaffirmed their commitment. Though it had taken 13 years, they had delivered justice. It was a reminder that fugitives can run, but they cannot hide forever. With persistence, cooperation, and international coordination, even the most elusive suspects can be caught. As the gavel came down and the case of Arnaldo Jimenez was formally closed, one truth remained. Nothing could undo the tragedy of May 2012. Estrella Carrera had walked down the aisle full of joy, believing she was beginning a new life. Instead, she became the victim of one of the most haunting crimes in recent memory. Her story would live on, not only in the memories of her family and children, but in the lessons it left behind for all who heard it. And so, the case of Estrella Carrera ended where it began, with a wedding dress. Once a symbol of love and celebration, it had become the silent witness to a crime that shocked a community and shook a nation. In the end, justice was served, but at a cost no family should ever have to bear.